Overrated is going to be the RICE method to treat injury. If you don't know, RICE is rest, ice, compression, elevation. Each have their own place. Rest is obviously important. If I want to take a quick cat nap, I'll elevate my feet and it helps me feel so great. Elevated above my heart, take like a 20-minute nap, I feel great. But for the most part, RICE is not what you want to use to treat injuries, unless it's a surface level injury, so right under the skin, whether it's swollen, black or blue, then you can go ahead and use the RICE method. I think it's effective then. The best way to treat injuries is to create blood flow in the area of the injury. You want the blood flow to bring in fresh nutrients, to help repair itself, to help make sure that it's not stagnant in that area, to help break up some of the scar tissue. So blood flow is really key to healing injuries versus the RICE method. To be clear, I'm not talking about like a cold therapy session. I'm talking more about like sitting there with ice wrapped around your hamstring because you have a hamstring tear, but really the hamstring tear is like super deep in there and you're treating it surface level. You want to create blood flow, whether that's through a bicycle, whether that's through walking on the treadmill, a jog. That's going to help heal you much quicker and more effectively than rest, ice, compression, elevation. Underrated, we're going to go with stretching. Now, there are many ways to rehabilitate the body, including foam rolling, trigger point therapy, massage, heat, cold. And don't get me wrong, I obviously love gadgets with all the reviews and tools that I have, but stretching is undefeated. And stretching is one of the ways you can help ease that pain and those aches. Stretching requires no additional equipment, can be done in any environment. It's a low impact activity and takes little effort. A few stretching tips: get warm before your stretch sessions. Can be a shower or like an actual warm up. Allow gravity to help you. So instead of like pulling and yanking on you, allow gravity to just let you sink into the stretch a little bit deeper. Don't feel like you need to become Stretch Armstrong in one session. It takes, again, consistency is the key here, is the theme. It takes multiple sessions to become flexible. Don't feel like you need to be able to do a back bend just because in one day. And finally, maybe the most important thing in stretching is to breathe. That's what I have the hardest trouble in. I always am up there holding my breath while I'm stretching when really I should be breathing deeper into the stretch.